I'm very happy to be introducing Paul Steinberg this afternoon to talk about his book, A Salamander's Tale, his frank and engaging memoir about his 30-year battle with prostate cancer and his own journey from physician to patient. After he was diagnosed, he made the determination that in order to survive, he needed to discard the statistics and make his own personal anecdote paramount, the result of which is both his survival and, fortunately for us, his book. He subsequently became an empowered patient, questioning the nature of what medicine knows about prostate cancer, and he also becomes a sort of philosopher patient, meditating on the meaning of life, sex, and the horrifying possibility of castration. Prostate cancer created a new reality for him, again, in his words, a kind of salvation, redemption, and regeneration. Steinberg is a psychiatrist who practices in Washington, D.C., and his work has appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. We're so happy to have him here with us today. Please help me welcome Dr. Paul Steinberg.
Thank you all for coming on Father's Day. Very impressive that you all are here, especially now that Hurricane Bill has gone away and it's actually nice out. I've got some wonderful professional PR people who are helping to promote the book, but I do have to thank not just you guys for coming, but also my family for doing incredible PR stuff. Helen's been amazing, and Marit and Ariel and her husband Jason have been fantastic in putting forth this book. It's been a great experience. And this book and the tour that I've been doing, we're going to California soon, up to New York and Connecticut in July. This book and this tour have been really, for me, a celebration of life. I learned early on that there's a lot of things that can go wrong in life, and certainly this book does talk about that. But when you do have some really positive things going on, really important to go for it, to just celebrate every opportunity that you have. So I hope that this book and this opportunity to talk to you is an opportunity to just celebrate life. I'm going to first talk about the book. Susan, of course, gave a great description about a good portion of it. I'm going to talk about the book and then read a couple of pages from first the prologue and then a final note that's at the end of the book. And if you want to know what goes on in between, you'll have to either use your imagination, or you might actually have to read the book and see what goes on in between. What makes the book unique to me, and I often refer to Norman Mailer to explain this point, back in 1959, Mailer wrote a book called Advertisements for Myself. It was a book of fragments, short stories, plays, some essays, and one of the essays was absolutely brilliant about his competitors, the people who were vying for writing the great American novel. Now, the great American novel is not that important these days, but back in the 1950s and 60s, everybody was competing for it, to vie for it, to actually create the great American novel. So he talked about his competitors, Vance Borgelli, Chandler Broussard, Saul Bellow, of course, James Jones, one of my favorites, Myron Kaufman, who wrote a book called Remember Me to God, J.D. Salinger. He had a great point in his essay. J.D. Salinger was the greatest mind still stuck in prep school. So these were some of the quotes that he made. But he had this incredible point back then that as great as these novelists are, as remarkable as their work is, I can't wait until they reach their 60s, their older years, when they're less self-conscious, when they're more willing to take risks, when they're really willing to let it all hang out a little bit, and again, just not playing it safe in the way that they might have in their 30s and 40s. Well, the problem was it never really happened. They didn't let it all hang out. A lot of them were one and done. That includes Ralph Ellison. In many ways, it includes J.D. Salinger. But what I think is really interesting, at least from my standpoint, about A Salamander's Tale is that I do let it all hang out. I do talk about, as Susan has pointed out, sex, drugs, lust, rock and roll, time and death, and the gods. It really covers everything that might be important in life. It really is, in many ways, a detective story. One of my friends said it's really kind of a whodunit, because I'm investigating not just the treatments for prostate cancer, surgery, which is less used now than it was 30 years ago, radiation, and then also investigating what are some of the antidotes for dealing with the various mutilations, if you will, from the treatments themselves, from surgery, from radiation. So in a figurative way, the book takes me to Russia, where the Russians were dealing with all sorts of nuclear catastrophes back in the 50s and 60s. And they kept repeating them because they were so secretive. They wouldn't tell the world what was going on, so nobody really had any chance to find some antidotes except for themselves trying to desperately figure those antidotes out. And they actually figured some things that were very useful to me. Back then, it was before Chernobyl. I had radiation back in 84, 85, over 30 years ago. It was before Chernobyl, but it was certainly after the Ural Mountains, where there was a radiation disaster there in the 50s. Right before I had radiation, there were major problems in a nuclear plant right at the Polish-Russian border. So figuring out some antidotes was really useful. When you read medical journals, invariably, the message at the end of any medical journal is we have to replicate these findings. Well, when you're talking to the Russians, it was speaking to the choir because they kept repeating them. So there were always efforts to try to figure out some antidotes, some solutions. And it also took me figuratively to China to see where acupuncture fits in. And it turns out the salamander has some ways of creating some electrical gradients that, in a sense, acupuncture does the same kind of thing. Obviously, we human beings can't regenerate like the salamander can. We can regenerate bones, we can regenerate skin, but we can't regenerate much else. But actually, acupuncture, it turns out, for animals, veterinarians use it, human beings can use it to create some efforts to regenerate. The other interesting thing is that salamanders do not get cancer. It's a pretty remarkable species. You can give them the worst, most carcinogenic substances, and all they do is produce some ectopic limbs. They like producing limbs of some sort, but they cannot get cancer under any circumstances whatsoever. The final third of the book, I get into my op-ed mode, as I call it. As many of you know, I've been fortunate enough to do a number of op-ed pieces in the New York Times, science section of the Times, and also the Washington Post, LA Times, elsewhere, which has been a lot of fun. But I've figured out unofficially, the op-ed editors won't admit this, that there are really two subjects you can't talk about in an op-ed page. And one is sex and lust. And I actually challenged the New York Times recently, the editor that I work with there. He loves my pieces, but I sent him a very graphic piece for Father's Day and for marriage equality. And he said, this is really interesting. It was based on one of the chapters in the book. This is really interesting. We are a family newspaper, but we don't like to use that word. And we're not sure we can use it, but I'm going to pass it around to my colleagues. They spent 72 hours deliberating about it. He usually lets me know within a day or so whether they're going to publish it, and they decided that, in fact, it was too graphic. So again, you may just want to read the chapter in the book to see some of this graphic stuff. But the other thing you really can't talk about very easily on an op-ed page is religion and spirituality, especially if it's controversial. But, you know, if you're a sentient being and you are dealing with a potentially deadly illness, you're going to go through some kind of transformation, and I certainly do. But most people, the trajectory is they become more committed Christians, they become born again, they become more committed Jews, born again, more committed Muslims. That does not happen to me. So again, these are things that make the book rather unique. The other thing, I was struck last week, last Sunday in the New York Times Sunday book review section, that the featured book that was reviewed was a derivative book from Camus' The Stranger. Now, it's fine that Moby Dick is based on an actual true story, but it's amazing to me that now there are books that are derivative of novels. So there's nothing derivative in this book. It's all the real deal. So I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue. And give you a sense of what I was dealing with. This goes back about 25 years ago, just to surgery and radiation were in 84, 85. But here's the prologue. The punishment, the chopping off of my balls, a literal castration. The crime, none, at least none I am aware of. I am not a rapist, let alone a serial rapist. I am not a pedophile. I am not a sex addict. Yes, I do enjoy sex. I am not the greatest lover, but I am not the worst. I am good enough. It is December 1989, and this self-appointed executioner of my love life is talking to me over the phone from New York City. I am in Washington, D.C. He is telling me what any self-respecting man would dread to hear. You need to have your testicles removed. It will save your life. You will die a quick and painful death if you do not undergo a castration. But wait, what about my very essence, my very spirit as a man, as a human being? Is this a new concept? Cut off your balls to save your face? Your testicles are your life, not unlike the choice given to Jack Benny by a mugger. Your money or your life, shouted the mugger to the notoriously cheapskate comedian. Benny stood there paralyzed, unable to choose. Likewise, my own paralysis. Doesn't existence lay too much on us? Can existence burden us with any more stark a choice? I can easily imagine the potential executioners of my orgasms sitting at rounds at a hospital in Manhattan discussing my case. The patient is a 41-year-old white married male psychiatrist living in Washington, D.C. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer 5 years ago and underwent a radical prostatectomy here at our hospital on October 5th, 1984. We thought we got it all, every bit of cancerous tissue. To be on the safe side, we had the patient go through 6 weeks of radiation to the prostate bed in order to eliminate any remaining cancer cells in that area. Unfortunately, there is evidence the cancer has returned. A new test, the prostate-specific antigen, we all know it now, it's ubiquitous, but that was a new test back in 88, 89, available at this hospital for the past 18 months, has shown a gradual rise from 0.6 in 1988 to 2.1 this December. The only source of this antigen has to be cancer cells, since his prostate has been completely removed. In a relatively young man like this, with a terribly aggressive disease, the only option is castration. As all of you in this room know, testosterone fuels the growth of these prostate cancer cells. It is urgent and essential that we eliminate all testosterone from this man's body as quickly as possible. and the most expeditious way to do so is by surgical castration over my dead body. Those facts do not tell the full story. They leave out a ton of desire. Where are the yearnings, the struggles and strivings in this doctorly narrative? Where's the mere mention of the orgasm? Yes, the orgasm. Can there be any more pleasurable experience in a man's or woman's life? Admittedly, food and other pleasures can approach the orgasmic, but there is nothing like the real thing, the real deal. Lust, libido, orgasm. The gods have set it up so that our most vital function, procreation, the survival of the species, the passing on of our genes, is suffused with the most unsubtle of pleasures. As if our instinct to replicate ourselves were not enough, the gods lured us with the promise of an exultant explosion of ecstasy, a momentary pleasure certainly, but one that, with the prospect of repeated paroxysms, can give us a self-assuredness that lasts a seeming lifetime. Back in the early and mid-20th century, the German psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich claimed that without the orgasm, we all would get cancer and we would shrivel up and die. On some level, the former protege of Sigmund Freud was simply trying to overcome the sexual repressiveness of Europe and the United States in the 19th and early 20th century. Accused of fraud for the promotion of his seemingly useless orgone box, Reich was even willing to go to prison. In fact, he died in the Lewisburg, Pennsylvania penitentiary, attempting to promote the worth of the orgasm. So here I was, facing the executioner of my orgasms. Although he delivered my sentence in a somber tone, I could not help but wonder how much unacknowledged sadism was involved in this pronouncement. As a physician myself, I knew all too well how much sadism exists in the helping professions. Just as there is a thin line between love and hate, there's also a thin line between helping and hurting, between public safety and public endangerment. Cops and criminals, doctors and patients, lovers and haters, sometimes it is difficult to tell the difference. In medical training, the dividing point takes place early in the first clinical rotation during the third year of medical school. The class separates almost in half, the skittish and squeamish versus the unaffected and undaunted. The first 2 years of medical school are not unlike the previous 16 years of schooling that most of us have gone through. Lots of book learning, studying, and more studying. Even the limited clinical training, the non-book learning in the first 2 years of medical school is rather benign, concentrating on learning how to listen to heart sounds and lung sounds, how to look at blood vessels in the eyes, and most importantly, how to interview people and get a history of their current problems. But this all changes with the onset of rotations in pediatrics, internal medicine, surgery, and obstetrics and gynecology. Suddenly, we're asked to poke and prod, stick and stab our patients, whether they are infants or octogenarians. By the second day of whatever clinical rotation we have been assigned to, we can see the impact of that first day of orientation. Half the class strides confidently off the elevator, unable to contain their enthusiasm for the opportunity to poke and prod. The other half leaves the elevator cautiously, wondering what the hell they've gotten themselves into. Somehow they, or I should say we, since I was one of this group, thought we were going to be helping people. Instead, we were using fellow human beings as experimental fodder, stabbing them with needles 10 or 20 times in order to take blood or insert IVs. As students, we could easily pick out the super sadists, the ones who immediately volunteered to do the lumbar punctures and any other invasive procedures. The spinal tap requires that you insert a needle the size of an ice pick into someone's back. A slight change in context, and for that same act, you're sitting in a courtroom facing a sentence of at least 3 to 5 years. Tubes put into people's urethras, cold hard speculums up vaginas, sigmoidoscopes up rectums into descending colons. In the early 1970s, before the advent of flexible fiber optic instruments, we had only rigid instruments, all the better to inflict pain and discomfort. Soon enough, we lost track of our humanity. Even those of us who had started out skittish and squeamish became detached from the impact of what we were doing. Is this what had happened to the urologist in New York City, who was matter-of-factly sentencing me to castration? Come up to New York City and we'll cut off your balls. Was this a playground threat, or trash talking, or bluster from a mafia hitman? I told myself there had to be another way to contain and control prostate cancer. So that gives you a sense of what I was up against. Fortunately, I didn't have anybody cut off my balls. They're still intact. So I'm going to read a final note. And I start off with a quote from Jess Walters, who wrote a book noir, if you will, called Citizen Vince. Not a great book, but there's one paragraph in the middle of it that's pretty amazing, and I'll just read that and then read my final note. A book can only end in one of two ways, truthfully or artfully. If it ends artfully, then it never feels quite right. It feels forced, manipulated. If it ends truthfully, then the story ends badly, in death. Life itself always ends badly. Hate to be a downer on that, but fortunately all of us are alive. I'm alive, so we can again celebrate that, as I mentioned. Many of us die a quick death, a heart attack, a stroke, our head severed in an automobile accident, whatever. Even cancers can lead to a precipitous death. Think pancreatic cancer and melanoma. But for those of us with prostate cancer, we live and die on the installment plan, a slow slog of a slaying. We lose our lust and libido, then gain it back. We lose our lust for life, then gain it back. We get bone metastases and get rid of them via an androgen blockade or through radiation. We do likewise with lung metastases and even brain metastases. We go through rehearsal after rehearsal for our own deaths. We practice and practice. We face a death sentence over and over again. Then we get reprieves. We escape the clutches of death until we no longer can escape. The lords of the kitchen normally boil the water first and then put the crabs, you can choose lobsters if you like, into the hot steamy water. The crabs do not know what hit them. They die a quick, precipitous death. But for crabs like myself, the lords have put us into water at room temperature and then have turned up the heat. We recognize what is happening and we hightail out of the pot. The lords gather us up again and put us back into the pot. The water is a bit warmer now. We know we can still escape and we do so. The next time the water is hotter still. We keep escaping, but we now know the end is nigh. But we deny the nighness. Ah, denial. Denial. N-I-L-E. Yes, the biggest river in Africa. We make jokes about denial. We deny we're in denial. Those who die precipitously cling to their denial right up until their precipitous death. It is beyond their imagination. Not sick even for one day in my life, they say. I've got the Reaper covered. He has nothing on me. I work out every day. I play tennis or basketball. I run practically every day. For those of us dying on the installment plan, we keep managing our escapes. We keep finding escape routes, and we keep assuming the new hatches will open. It goes without saying that we live ultimately to die, but when facing the rapidly boiling water, we are dying to live. Our denial of death allows us to extract every ounce of power and creativity out of every moment. No, I am not helpless. I can escape from that torrid water a third time, a sixth time. Feverish, slowed hopelessly by the heat, I still push forward. I grab the edge of the pot with my claws. I still hold out hope. I will still make my escape. So before I finish up and take questions, I don't know if any of you saw the James Salter obituary in the New York Times yesterday. It was just a wonderful quote from him at the end of the obituary, and this is one of the reasons that I write, and it's so fun to have a book out there for all of you to take a look at. His quote was, "Life passes into pages if it passes into anything at all." So it's wonderful to just have my life, or part of my life, or a more difficult part of my life, pass into pages, and there may not be much else that any of us can have that passes for any length of time, but pages do last. So I'll take questions. Do you want? Who?
Go ahead.
Okay, Barry.
Paul knows
I've seen this guy before. He asks lots of questions.
Yeah. first, before I ask my question, reading the book, I really found it very good. But for those that are reading the book who for the first time, I would go to the last 2 chapters first and then go back to the beginning. It sort of summarizes where you're heading, and then it's easier to read, I find. No, I mean, it just, he gets to the point.
I'll have to tell my publisher that.
Yeah, okay.
For the soft cover, we'll do it differently, Barry.
No, I'm right-handed. You do that also. Do you want the microphone? Here's my question. In your book, you do talk about an experience you had when you were at Maryland with a bunch of students. You got them together, they were all related, friendly, and it was very warm and moving and whatever. Now, jumping to Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, he mentions that when Steve Jobs first told people he had cancer, he had doctors around him that wouldn't talk to each other. Okay, so now, is your experience as a psychiatrist working with groups of people influenced how you knew you couldn't come up with a common solution because everybody's doing it their own way, they all want to get a Nobel Prize? I mean, was that in your mind when you were coming up with approaches to this?
Well, I don't know if this answers the question, but certainly physicians from different subspecialties certainly didn't talk to each other very easily. I knew back in 1984 after surgery that I was the subject of grand rounds. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to find out what they were talking about. But as you know, surgeons always think they got it all, even if they're not even close to having gotten it. At least that's been my experience a lot of the time. And I love their optimism. Yeah. It's great, and for 5 years I could enjoy that optimism and assume they did get it all. But they don't necessarily talk to the radiation oncologists. But certainly one of the things that I've been able to do is get people together to talk about at least my situation. And I've been fortunate to have an internist who's been great at contacting a number of people and get some ideas from them. Often those ideas were wrong. When I did have a lung metastasis back in 2004, they told me it couldn't be prostate cancer. Prostate cancer doesn't go to the lungs. But, after 20 years, it can go anywhere. It's an old disease, and it just hangs around and goes to various different places.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Because you took certain decisions and you took certain approaches, did you get professional explosions by people saying he's not listening or whatever? Because these people, as I said, want to get a Nobel Prize, and they think they're right, and you're basically rejecting.
Well, I did get some explosions, not necessarily from anything that I anticipated. There was an experience back in 1985 when I came back from New York City after the surgery, was going to be going through radiation, and the surgeon up in New York said, listen, I'm a protege of a guy at Hopkins. It turned out to be a fellow named Pat Walsh, who's still around, and Helen and I, my wife and I, went in to see Pat, and he essentially threw us out of the office. Why didn't you come to me first instead of up to Mitch Benson up in New York? I mean, these guys have incredible, healthy narcissism is good, but pathological narcissism is just awful. And so I'm glad Helen was with me at the time, because we just couldn't believe it. Usually you pinch yourself if something good happens. We were pinching ourselves because how could this guy actually do that? We had actually seen Pat Walsh on Charlie Rose a few years ago. Charlie Rose must have had prostate surgery, or else he wouldn't have had Pat Walsh on. And Charlie Rose asked Pat Walsh, what's it like to save people's lives with surgery, to make these incredible things happen in securing people from the difficulties of prostate cancer? And Pat Walsh, without an ounce of humbleness or irony, said, Charlie, I have to tell you that I am the humblest man in the world. So his humility was not lost on me, but there are some crazy people in the field of medicine and surgery.
Okay.
So you've been practicing, I gather, still are, and I'm a practicing social worker in a similar boat that you are in. And so at what point did you tell patients about your situation, and how did you work out how to do that, if you can talk about that briefly? I suffered the delusion, I think, that I'm protecting clients by not telling them about my own health, and I think certainly it's not about me, but you get the gist of my question?
Yeah. I didn't specifically tell people about it back in 1984. I did write some pieces for the Washington Post. Washington Post back in the mid-'80s was just starting their health section. And I wrote about the possibility that I would need to go through castration. And talked about our cat being neutered, and it looked like I might have to be neutered. But at any rate, some of my patients saw the piece and asked me about it. But people take what they want out of something. They weren't nervous about my situation. If anything, people found it inspiring that I was dealing with this and that I was still out working. I did take about 3 or 4 weeks off back in 1984 after surgery because surgery was much more mutilative than it was 30 years later, certainly these days. So it took a while to recover from the surgery. And then be in a position where the recovery was great enough that I could undergo radiation shortly thereafter. But I was back at work after about a month, was able to get back into playing tennis and even basketball. And people just sort of look at you and say, "Oh, he looks okay. I guess he's fine," whether he is or not. But the fact is that I've been open about this. I've been transparent about it. Wrote a piece in 2004 about my experience with this lung nodule that a number of people were convinced had to be a primary lung cancer. Turned out not to be. But I've been open about it, and if people read about it, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yes. Do you want to come up to the mic? Great. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you. I need assistance. How have you influenced, do you suppose or know, the treatment of this type of prostate cancer? Because I believe there are two, there's an aggressive one and another one that can go to sleep. Have you had any experience with others who've gone through this? Other than being written about probably in medical journals, has this done anything positive for others?
The question is, were there things that that I was able to do that to deal with an aggressive cancer, things that I could teach other people,
Have others follow the example?
or follow the example. I did have and do have a very aggressive cancer. I've continued to have to be very vigilant about it. I've been very, very fortunate. Back in 1989, as I explained in the book, when I discovered that the PSA was rising, and at that time there was just an incredible chorus of physicians who were insisting that I had to have permanent surgical castration. I went up to New York City. The original surgeon had suggested that I actually go through this test that they were thinking that might be helpful, called a monoclonal antibody test. Monoclonal antibodies have turned out to be very helpful lately, but back in 1989, they were extremely primitive. It was pretty useless, and they actually said that I had multiple metastases in the carotid, in the lymph nodes of my carotid artery, which actually is not where prostate cancer ever goes. But they had a surgeon waiting for me to dissect the lymph nodes in my prostate. And fortunately, I don't know if my internist is here, but I was able to reach him. This was again back in 1989, and said, "What the heck do I do? They want to bring me into the surgical suite and remove these lymph nodes." There was silence at the other end. I was, again, just very lucky to reach him during the lunch hour time. And this is a guy who I don't think curses that much. Maybe I'm wrong. But he said, "Get the fuck out of there before they kill you." So I've been very fortunate, but while I was up in New York, I went over to Sloan Kettering and met with Howard Shearer, who was one of the more expert people in dealing with prostate cancer. And I said, all I want to do is pick your brain for 5 minutes, tell me what's going on in dealing with prostate cancer besides castration. And he said, there is a guy up in Vancouver, British Columbia, is doing some interesting things with an intermittent androgen blockade, but I don't think you're appropriate for it. I saw your scans with these monoclonal antibodies, and I think you have very aggressive disease that's everywhere in your body. Again, it turned out not to be true. And Nick Brukovsky, whom I describe in the book, was extraordinarily helpful out in Vancouver. Vancouver back then was sort of the Siberia of medical care. Nobody listened to people from Canada. But his approach to prostate cancer ended up becoming the de rigueur treatment. So I've been able to pass that on, and Nick, who passed away a few months ago, was able to pass that on, and people in New York, San Francisco, everywhere are really recognizing that permanent castration is not the way to go. Less is more and more is less. And that's certainly a valuable lesson that I took to heart in the book. But those are the kinds of things that we can learn and hopefully pass on to people.
Let me ask sort of other side of the question, similar to the one our last questioner asked. Patients, those of us who didn't go to medical school and who inevitably, if we're lucky enough to live without being hit by a car or a truck, will face some sort of illness or help someone else who we love. What advice do you have for patients who didn't go to medical school and who are, to a large extent, bound by the rules of insurance companies? What's the best way to navigate a system in which we don't necessarily read the medical journals and have the ability, while we may have a great internist, may not have all the kinds of connections that in your difficult time you were able to have?
It's a very good question. Again, the question, what do we do if we don't have that medical knowledge? And I think it's really valuable if you can muster it to have some kind of ombudsman, a nurse or a physician. You know, when you're in the midst of this, and I certainly remember this back in 1984 after getting diagnosed with ultrasound and a biopsy. You know, the doctor may be telling you what you need to do, but it's really impossible. Your head is swirling, as all of you know, and it's really important to have somebody else there. Even if you're a doctor, you need somebody else there, an ombudsman, to help you sort some of this stuff out and see if there are other options and get some other ideas. But if you have somebody in your life, a family member who has some expertise, take advantage of that and hope that they have some willingness to question some conventional wisdom. Often the conventional wisdom is right on target, so and that's happening more and more so. We're getting closer to the truth these days. But certainly back in the 80s and 90s, there were certain ideologies that had taken hold in prostate cancer, and I'm sure in other areas. In the New York Times today, there's a great front page piece about how medical care has changed for heart attacks. It's phenomenal. And even with prostate cancer, there are new scans that are developing, PET scans, that can be really helpful. There's a guy down in Phoenix, Arizona, who can pick up metastases when the PSA is as low as 0.5, when it should be 0 if you've lost your prostate. So it may not be new treatments that are developing necessarily, but new ways of diagnosing these things that are really remarkable.
Addressing her question and kind of your approach, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer 5 years ago, intermediate risk, they call it. And some of the doctors I went to see said, you have a cancer, take care of it. And others said, well, if you don't do anything for 5 years, you'll probably be okay. But I found that I had to challenge constantly. I had to read and had to be my own advocate. Now, as a trial attorney, that wasn't that difficult. but for most people, I think it's extremely difficult. Most people just do what the doctor tells them to do. And in your case, you would have been castrated 25 years ago or whatever it is.
Exactly.
And I would have had my prostate removed 4.5 years ago, and I haven't. I've been fighting and having at what they call active surveillance, and so far, so good. But that's obviously, I don't have the kind of cancer that you did or still have, apparently. So I've been fortunate, at least vis-a-vis you. But it's a constant fight. You have to take on people and not be afraid to challenge. Even people at Sloan Kettering and Penn Medical Center and some of the finer institutions in the country.
You're absolutely right. You do need an advocate, an ombudsman. I'm thinking of medical care, but maybe have a trial lawyer in your family. Who can be a really tough, rough advocate and questioning things and saying, what's the proof? What's the evidence here? And again, questioning some of the conventional wisdom. And if you I used to think that being a psychiatrist wasn't really being a real doctor because there were questions about the evidence, the proof. But when I got prostate cancer in '84, I realized, man, urologists and oncologists aren't really doctors either in many ways. They really don't have a lot of evidence for some of the things that they're, and even the surgery, the prostatectomy, it's diminishing in its use these days. So things that we assumed were absolutely proof positive needed to be done back in '84 or in '89. These are things that we've come to question, and we're getting closer and closer to the truth about what works. But it's really valuable to have somebody who can be a bulldog and be there as an ombudsman for any patient who is figuring out what to do.
Yes. You want to go to the microphone?
So all of these questions, I was going through all of this, and I guess for me, what all these questions come down to, and if you'll pardon the expression, maybe it's in the book, but what gave you the balls to keep saying no?
I took the line from Patrick Henry: "Give me libido or give me death." So, the idea that at the age of 40 I was going to be castrated, that's not a life. There has to be some other way to go about this. And even if I have to go through chemical castration for a few months, at least I know that 6 months later I might get lucky again. It just, when I've talked to, I was in a prostate cancer conference up in Vancouver about 5 or 6 years ago, and even then a number of the experts were saying permanent castration was necessary. And my point in a piece that I gave there was at least talk to the patient, see what they want. And if libido and orgasms and sex are not important to them, okay, then maybe go with some other treatments, or with castration. But at least talk to the patient and ask what interests they might have.
Thanks.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
You've touched on the edge of this several times in terms of questions earlier about has the medical community learned anything from your specific experiences, but you've either resisted or haven't chosen to speak yet. Have you had the satisfaction of going back to any of the so-called experts and saying, I'm still here and you were wrong?
Well, I would not go back to Pat Walsh. I don't know where he is these days, but I have been in touch with Mitch Benson here and there, who is the surgeon who did the original prostatectomy, and he's a good guy, and again. There was no effort to be malicious, to do anything specifically and voluntarily and purposefully harmful. It's just an ideology. People get into a particular mode, and this is the way we do things. And I've kept in touch with some of these people, but I've been very fortunate in just getting involved with some brilliant people, even in faraway places like Vancouver, to be able to see what else can be done. Not sure exactly what I could do with some of the people. Obviously, there were ideas that were prominent back in the 80s and 90s that people have come to realize are just wrong. One of the ideas of the book is to get across to people that they need to be sometimes bulldogs and be ready to question things. And I hope that can be the legacy from this book as well.
We have one last question.
You've discussed how over the last 30 years you've challenged the medical profession. Today there's another challenge on top of that, and that's the cost of medicine and the insurance industry. Did that affect or influence any of your decisions throughout this trial that you've had? And how do you see approaching and dealing with those two together?
Well, I've been fortunate in being a physician. I've been able to, for example, when there are medications that I am able to give myself subcutaneously, most people would have to go to their doctor every month to get the medication. I've learned how to do it myself. But when I went through, for example, hyperbaric oxygen to help deal with the effects from the radiation, that was something that I wouldn't have been able to do now because it would just be prohibitively expensive. At that time, it was available for divers who had the bends, for men and women who might have tried to commit suicide through through the gas exhaust in their car. So I went to this guy in Mount Vernon, Virginia, where they were mostly dealing with divers who had the bends, and said, listen, the Russians think that this is the only approach we can use to deal with the effects from radiation. And he was this risk taker. He said, let's go for it. But that was again in 1985. You can't really go for it these days with that kind of thing. And I was able to go through 60 hyperbaric oxygen treatments at the time. I noticed that the reliever for the Nationals, Soriano, uses a hyperbaric oxygen chamber in his home after he pitches. I don't think he's in the major leagues any longer, unfortunately, but he said it did help him stay longer. But I was just fortunate. Back in 84, 85, if a doctor said, let's try this, let's use it, the insurance companies were willing to go along with it, but that's not the case now. And I'm not sure what we do. Fortunately, I've learned that less is more and more is often less. So sometimes some of the treatments that I've been able to use have been really quite cost effective and not be too expensive, but that's relatively rare.
Thank you.
Thank you all again.